Hi, this is Mike Pucciarelli, and today's webinar is going to be about how we use Adobe Photoshop and Camera Raw when I process the images. I'm first going to talk about Camera Raw, then I'll talk about Adobe Photoshop. And these are all the images. This is what the finished product looks like. So we're going to go into Camera Raw. We're going to do Control R. We'll set the default. Control R. Set the default. Control R. And do Control R. We'll come up here and cursor set the default. These are what the finished products looks like. So I'm going to go into Camera Raw. I'm going to leave the blue the way it is. I'm going to reduce the highlights. Increase the shadows. I'm going to improve the texture. I'm going to improve the clarity. So I'm going to improve the texture with 8. I'm going to do the clarity with 7. You got S curve for the to make a contrast. So I'm going to do sharpening. I'm going to do 100 over at least 140. I'm going to do noise reduction at 50. I'm going to do colors noise reduction. Increase at least by 10. I'm going to come over to optics. I'm going to do remove chromatic aberration. I'm going to do use profile corrections. On use profile corrections, the lens and camera I use come up. I'm using a 50-meter lens. I'm using a Canon. And the distortion of the geometry, I'm just going to click the A. I'm going to click Constrain Crop. Then I'm going to do, you see how the right part is darker than the left part? I'll try to fix that. I'm going to click Done. I'm going to do Camera Raw. I'm looking at the photograph. Looks like the highlights are way too powerful, so I'm going to tone down the highlights. Increase the shadow detail. I'm going to do texture. I'm going to increase the clarity. Kind of like an S curve for the curve, then put more contrast. I'm going to do sharpening. At least 140. We'll do noise reduction around 50. I'm going to do color noise. I'm going to look at the color noise. About 10. Remove chromatic aberration. This removes all color problems with the edges. I'm going to use, profile corrections. I'm using that same 50-meter lens. I'm going to straighten out by using the auto feature of the geometry. I'm going to click done. I'm going to do Control or Command R. I'll try to find a neutral. Looks like the highlights are too powerful. I'm going to improve the details in the shadows. I'm going to improve the texture. Even though there's no data, it won't hurt to do an S curve. I mean, I always like to use an S curve, regardless if there's data or not, just for the good practice. But at least use 140. Noise reduction. Of at least 50. I'm going to do color noise. I'm going to skip the color mixer. I'm going to skip the color grading. No correct, no problem with the geometry distortion. I'm going to click done. I'm going to do Control or Command R. I'm looking at the image. Try to find a gray. It's like the highlights are too powerful. I'm going to improve the texture. I'm going to improve the clarity, not the dehaze. Set the dehaze back to 0. I'm not going to touch the vibrance or saturation. I'll do an S curve, regardless of what data is in there, for good practice. For sharpening, do at least 140. Noise reduction, 50. I'm going to skip over the optics. I'm going to have both these boxes checked. Remove chromatic aberration. Use profile corrections. Now look at the photograph. I'm going to try to make it even the light. I'm going to click the auto for the geometry. And make the light even. I'm going to do Control or Command R. I'm going to find a neutral. I'm going to tone down the highlights. I'm going to improve the shadow detail. I'm going to improve the texture, about 5. I'm going to try to improve the clarity, about a 7 or a 5. To an S curve to bring out the contrast. The sharpening, I want to use color noise. Like try to use at least 10. I don't see, I don't think it'll hurt to use at least 10. Optics, if I have both of these checked, when I check chromatic aberration, I'm removing any color problems of the edges of the photograph of the subject. When I check off profile corrections, tells me the camera and lens, I'm still using the 50-meter lens. Geometry. And click done. I'm going to do new share. Now I'm going to go into Adobe Photoshop. I'm going to open up every one of these images. I'll go to the first image. Move my layer thing here. Make the photograph a little smaller. I'm going to run some actions. And I'll talk about what's going on with the actions, but first comes first. With the action down over here. I'm gonna get a brush. Make sure that I'm at the normal blend mode for this part of the photo editing. And for the brushes, I always like to use like a soft round brush. Make my brush a little bigger with one of the braces keys. So I'm trying to bring this out better. The glass and the reflection. Suppose I wanted to make the photograph dark quicker. You just use the block dropper key. Suppose I wanted to make the photograph whiter or lighter in a single mouse click. A lot of times I just use the auto. And I'm going to run my frequency separation. I like to do all my cloning on the high frequency layer. And then my low frequency, I like to do the Gaussian. So I'm going to zoom. Let me see if I could just clone this. I'm going to run some actions to sharpen and other things. I like to use to recreate a layer. It's great for contrast. I'm going to put a block frame. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my actions. I'm going to show what's going on behind the scenes. It's the first action that I use. It calls this action. It does other stuff. These are settings, and it calls other actions. And this is the other action where it calls these actions. The last one, it sets the mode to soft light. And then I'm using this one for the frame. It causes action. There's a condition. There's a condition for the landscape. There's a condition for the non-landscape. So now I showed you some actions, but when I export, I'm going to export preferences where I do a lot of posting. I turn to a JPEG, use quality of 100, ask for it to export each time. The copyright and confo is in there. Convert the sRGB. So when I do quick export, all the settings are there. What I'm going to do, run some actions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom this in a little. So I'm going to burn in improvements and I'm going to dodge in improvements. And I'm going to use a very soft brush, same soft brush as always. Make sure that I'm painting whites on a black mask. If I did too much, use the X. Does it make this a dark photograph? Does it make this a white photograph in one mouse click? A lot of times, when I use this for like the hideaway specks, a lot of times I just use the middle slider. Run some more actions. And run a different set of actions. I'm going to do a black frame. I'm going to do a gray frame. I want to go backwards. What I'm going to do is I'm going to crop it. So a lot of empty space. I'm gonna run that action again. I'm gonna run the black frame, the gray frame. I chose gray because I felt like the gray frame adds more to the photograph than the black frame. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show my actions. So the gray frame, it calls other actions, it calls a condition. This is where I use the fade. I change the opacity to 100. Mode is luminosity. And then when I click on this, all these actions happen. Then I use Dustus and Stratus, have it set at 3, not 41. The speckle. Sometimes I like to use Shift F5. One way. But I'm also going to use something else, is a Gaussian blur. I could do, I'll use a Gaussian blur. A lot of negative space. I'm going to run some actions. Make this smaller, easy to work with. I got some work to do. Throw away this layer. Now what I'm going to do, the first thing I'm going to try to do is I'm going to burn in endogenous improvements. When I burn, I'm at a luminosity blend mode. When I dodge, I'm at a screen. And it's the same soft brush. So I'm really concerned about the subject. Let's see if I could. Get that too much, so I go black. No, there's several things I can do to get rid of those spots. I'm going to do select subject. Actually, I'm going to do Control D. I'm going to do, let's see. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do Control Shift I, and then I'm going to do Control J. Then I'm going to do filter. I'm going to make the photograph, I'm going to make it dark. It's probably too dark. Control Z. Make it light. I'll do Control Z. Too much blank space, so I'm going to run some actions. This is with the soft blend mode. Go to the frame. It's set to 300. The longest side, which is the width, is set to 4,000. This is the action. It calls action. There's a condition. The landscape, and then if it's non-landscape, this is the action I use with the soft, where these actions defined elsewhere. Soft bypass is right here. The blend mode is soft. There's the first action that I use. Calls this action. Those are the steps. Cause these black and white signature. So I'm going to run this action. I'm going to run my actions. This is a black plexi. I'm going to use the white signature. Now, I'm going to check something. Actually, I'll let it. I'm going to try to straighten this out. Oh, I'm going to tools in Photoshop. Using the wrong thing. Try to preserve as much as I can. I can crop. There's another way we can do it too. It's where Shift F5. Shift F5. Shift F5. Got a lot of dust here, and there's many ways we can deal with this. Maybe do frequency separation, maybe clone. But there's a way we can do this where you Control Shift I. I'm going to do Control J. Bring a layer, then I'm going to click on that. I'm going to filter Gaussian Blur. Makes a nice blurred background, but doesn't affect the subject. Same thing. My goal is to bring this out better. I paint very carefully. So this is the subject. Where? So I took out all the spots by putting this into a Gaussian blur. I want to make it darker. If I feel like I ever did it, I sometimes like to do this, is brush. And %. Just to make the subject pop out a little more. Basically using a multiply, and I'm just unrevealing, and I'm painting at a opacity of 25%. Then I'm going to run some actions. like these, one with a soft high pass. This is a nice copy. Then I have to run this action that the image set to 200, and that since the height is bigger, it's set to 4,000. I'll show you the actions. I call this action, it calls other actions, and this properties are all set, like IBC width. Is up here. Obviously, big height's up here too. So this is an action that's being called somewhere else. It's the first action that I call. I call this action, make changes. I call two other actions, white water signature, black water signature. When I call, it calls this action, and this action is defined up here. So I'm going to do the last image. I'm going to run some actions. I'm going to be, painting on a black mass. I'm going to be revealing, I'm going to be burning at a luminosity. I'm going to do that right now. Make sure that my brush is normal and the opacity is 100. And I'm just going to turn it to black because I did too much on the edges. I could do frequency separation, but or I could just do it like this. Simplify. I'm going to do Control J. What I'm going to do is this. I'm going to do the blur. It's a very high radius. And it takes care of the problem. And that's only me to do cloning. The action I'm going to use is create a background layer, a copy of it. And I'm going to do a frame, and I'm going to, let's see, I think. I want to go backwards. I'm going to run the black. I think it looks better with the black. There, that looks more catchy. It's actions. And you've seen the actions. I'll show them again. The action I called, it calls this action. It calls the other actions and the condition. Calls the first action that I clicked. Calls this action, does the steps. Calls the black signature to the white signature. This is the action I use in these actions. I like to use filter at a very high radius to get out the specks. Well, that concludes the Adobe Photoshop of images of part 1 and part 2 of the complete class on the black Plexiglass table. Thank you very much for listening, and maybe consider liking and subscribing to my YouTube channel, Still Life Photography of Michael Pucciarelli. Thank you very much for listening.